Who controls the operations of the government? How does the government run under the purview of independent professionals, mesh with democratic control over said institutions? Unitary executive theory in the United States looks to solve this balance of democracy and professionals by giving the president control over the government. Where this starts to sound more like divine right of precedence is when that control shifts from being a more vague directional power to total and absolute control. The more extreme side of things, which this video focuses on, views the president as the sole arbiter and executor of the American government, the embodiment of the people's will, to whom the federal government and law is nothing but a tool. As the old expression goes, nobody is above the law, except of course for the president. So where did this viewpoint come from? Does anyone of actual importance espouse this stuff? And also, what are some of its arguments? There's a limited historical reference to unitary executive theory. One such reference, for example, dates back to the 1920s, when the Supreme Court declared that the president had the right to sack his own appointees, regardless of the input of the Senate. The popular birth of the more extreme view, however, dates back to the unfair prosecution of an innocent man, a gentle soul who was undermined by the Department of Justice and railroaded out. I am, of course, referring to Richard Nixon. As a recap for those of you who, like myself, had parents who were young around this time, the Department of Justice was investigating the Watergate break-in. This investigation was headed by Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox. To shut down this investigation, Nixon demanded his Attorney General to fire Cox. His Attorney General resigned. So did the Deputy Attorney General after receiving the same order. It was at this point that Solicitor General Robert Bork received the same order. He decided to be the one to be the president's hatchet man. Bork would go on to be a major figure in the conservative legal movement, for playing a key role in the founding of an obscure organization known as the Federalist Society. During this time, he was eager to explain that Nixon had been completely in his legal rights to shut down an investigation into himself. Some people may vaguely remember Bork as something that conservative senators and newspapers cryptically referenced during the Kavanaugh hearings, often under the term borking, which is not to be confused with boofing or any sex act. The term borking comes from the fact that Bork would have also been a Supreme Court justice if Ronald Reagan had had his way. Having first been successfully nominated to the Court of Appeals by Reagan in 1982, Reagan would soon attempt to nominate him to the Supreme Court. His nomination to the Supreme Court was blocked by Democrats in the Senate for that small hatchet man thing, as well as a record that more than suggested hostility to abortion and civil rights, enough so that Joe Biden actively opposed the guy as an extremist. Random name drop here, but there was this odd guy named Bill Barr who would play a role in this legal movement, first developing a sterling reputation for a brilliant idea. His idea being to pardon everyone under investigation for the Iran-Contra scandal, effectively nuking the then ongoing congressional investigation. Ever since then, this wonderful man has been an obscure figure and will probably remain so. On February 5, 2020, the Senate of the United States lent this theory its support following charges of impeachment. The acquittal is not surprising. What was surprising was the reason many of these senators gave. Not that the president hadn't committed a crime, but that such actions may have been disagreeable, but legitimate. Many co-signed that Trump had a perfectly good phone call and was totally within his rights to hijack aid money to whatever he decided was a good purpose. It didn't take long after acquittal for the public reprisals to fall on witnesses in a way that would make Erdogan blush. In a time since, there's also been no shortage of sackings targeting pretty much any given government oversight official. While cowardness, cravenness, and partisanship have all rightfully received some share of the blame for this, it's worth noting that there are some actively cheering on this purge, most notably the Attorney General for some unknowable reason. So why, I guess? This line is the subject of contention. Executive power is not defined in the Constitution, and historically this has been interpreted as having a power over appointments with some ability to direct government agencies in a specific direction. A classic example of this being executive orders. However, another interpretation, the interpretation that this video focuses on, is that it covers the entire executive branch. This would include all intelligence and law enforcement agencies, and all other agencies, in their entirety. This is also the interpretation that happens to mean if the president does it, it's legal. If an act that was against the law is committed by the president, then the president has simply decided, within his powers, that the law doesn't apply, and any attempts to enforce the law, absent his will, would be wrong. This could be relevant in far-flung, abstract theoretical situations, such as the president shutting down investigation into himself and cronies, or something bizarre like his associates not testifying to Congress, or deciding to block the execution of transferring aid money and requesting that a foreign power dig up dirt on his opponents. Purely theoretical things. Some other things that might be legal include pardoning people for cash, lying to Congress, using the Justice Department to crack down on his opponents, hunting human beings for sport on the White House lawn, ignoring any laws passed by Congress, tax fraud, embezzlement, using the FBI to spy on his opponents, directing government agencies to pay the president, punishing states that vote against you. You get the idea. Literally anything. So there's a few not great effects to taking this interpretation. So why do people support it? Some people like the taste of boot. This isn't the whole story, but it does play a part. About a quarter of the population believes in the need for a daddy to take control who will tell them what to do. The idea of parliamentary government filled with grey bureaucrats just does not have the same sex appeal. So let's focus on ideas. The government of the United States, or for that matter, pretty much any wealthy country, tends to be quite large, with numerous varying independent agencies. And in American conservative thought, this has always been a problem. Unitary executive theory does provide basically a way of solving this question of who do these people actually answer to? Because many of these officials are unelected, there is the question of democratic legitimacy. And basically the answer that unitary executive theory gives to this is that ultimately everybody answers to the president, a democratically elected official. This is probably the most common argument that you're going to hear for unitary executive theory. Though here perhaps it can be revealing to step back and take a look at how these types of things are settled in other countries. Here in Canada, most of the government can be considered of the professionalized, non-political sort. There's substantially fewer appointed positions. This has yet to result in the Gulag Archipelago in the Canadian Arctic, and looking at most countries, this is closer to the norm. That's not to say that one should just trust agencies with full independence. There have of course been abuses of power performed by independent agencies, and this issue only becomes more acute in the areas of law enforcement and the military, which ultimately tend to lie at the heart of these sort of unitary executive power claims. I mean, not to completely disparage the Commission for Fine Arts, but we don't care too much what's happening there. But, perhaps before throwing it all to the direct control of the president, we should consider a few things. Nobody loves bureaucrats. At least, normal people under normal situations don't. However, the ability of employees to report their bosses have a significant impact here, as do various organizational safeguards. At the end of the day, it's well impossible to abolish an entire agency as Republicans make a habit of promising to do. None of this is true when it comes to removing a president. Under a system where the president is effectively subject to no laws and the government reports directly to him, the only method of oversight is impeachment. This either means accepting that the laws just won't be enforced, or going, oh, the president was impeached? All's good. What's the news today? Unless impeachment becomes the default response to all presidential errors, this system is bad. The head of any government agency will have their own priorities, and some of that will be reflected in policy. However, it would be rather unusual to have a broad conspiracy spanning multiple government agencies. But to the level that this exists, it is far less likely than giving those same powers to the president, who may be more than a little tempted to use his now vastly expanded powers to his own benefit. All that unitary executive theory does in this case is it makes it harder to remove bad actors so long as they're tied to the president. It should probably be worth noting that there is the argument that you need a president to be above the law to thwart scheming bureaucracy and a corrupt judiciary. Unfortunately, this is kind of the basis of a liberal democracy. So, if you're a fan of the government structures of, say, Turkey or Hungary, then great. Otherwise, not so much. Then there's the Xi Jinping school of thought, that by using your expanded powers to crack down only on the corrupt officials, then there's really no need to be worried. But here's the problem. You can expand that definition to pretty much everyone, and if you only crack down your opponents, it's simply a more effective way to perform a purge. This is why a liberal democracy is increasingly part of the dictator chic. You can not only get rid of your opponents, but make yourself more popular in the process. Another issue that comes up in the American context is the idea that the Constitution only meant for there to be a legislative, judicial, and executive branch, and never shall these cross. Then some radical left-wingers on the courts create a heretofore unknown idea of an agency reporting to Congress, roughly a century ago. The penchant for those claiming to be originalists to ignore judicial precedent means that ignoring a century worth of law doesn't mean much. But it's also worth noting that early presidents rarely vetoed laws, and as early as the country's founding, there were fights over the radical bureaucrats at the First and Second National Bank. Additionally, it's worth noting that it can be difficult to disentangle legislative versus executive powers. For example, the ability for presidents to raise tariffs for national security. One might wonder why Congress didn't give themselves oversight on this one. Except for the fact that it actually did. It was the Supreme Court that decided that congressional vetoes, even though they had been standard for 50 years, were illegitimate. This had the effect of removing the ability of Congress to simply vote down the tariffs the president had raised, something that might be relevant today. Kind of back to troublingly authoritarian undertones, we have the idea of security. After all, what freedoms can exist if a people are conquered? This is used to justify the idea that the president needs these powers to provide security at a moment's notice. On the domestic front, however, it's hard to think the president needs to control the Justice Department to keep the country together. The same separation of the state from its leaders is pretty much the norm in every other democracy. This is, however, useful for cracking down on dissidents who threaten the president. This might seem like a bit of a stretch, but already nobodies like Alan Dershowitz have been pushing the idea that the president views his re-election as a national security issue, then he's justified in doing whatever. Not that unitary executive theory need only apply to domestic policy. This can also apply to foreign security. For example, Bill Barr, a well-known advocate for unitary executive theory, has in the past argued the president could enter into a war without congressional approval, even though the War Powers Act explicitly prohibits it. The Constitution explicitly gives Congress control over declarations of war. This interpretation was pushed by Bill Barr in 1991, advising H.W. Bush on the Gulf War, and he stated this position again in 2001. Projecting your current ideas onto the past is hardly unheard of, and can be done with legal documents as well. This kind of begs the question to ask why unitary executive theory became popular for whatever reason following the impeachment of Nixon, particularly, though not exclusively, within the conservative movement. This could stem from the conviction that the government as a whole is inherently bad. Embracing this theory means you can say that the administrative state, in and of itself, is unconstitutional. It also might have something to do with the fact that Republicans created something of an ideological ecosystem dedicated to undermining presidential accountability. Government oversight has often been at odds with Republican governments. A media sphere that exists for ideological defense may try to push ideas that punish whistleblowers and seek to excuse presidential misdoings by claiming that they were justified by authority or unprovable or so on and so forth. So, we have an ahistorical, unprecedented legal theory with troublingly authoritarian undertones being referenced by nobodies in the Office of Legal Counsel, the president's legal defense team, and that keeps being promoted by conservative justices, generally under Republican presidencies for whatever reason. In short, everything is probably fine. In case things aren't entirely fine, I'm not sure what to do. That said, it is useful to be literate to these issues and their importance. So that, somebody who's speaking proper legal language, calmly and dressed in a suit, can also be pushing somewhat deranged theories for how society ought to be governed. If you found this video to be interesting or useful, it'd be great if you could share it. If it hits 10,000 views, it would likely come across as one of the top search results for a relatively obscure topic. At the very least, it would likely be a good counterpoint to the current list of Federalist Society videos explaining why unitary executive theory is a great idea. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. And if you did, I'm planning to make more videos examining the politics and philosophies of other areas. If you want to hear more, it would be great if you could give me a follow.